Nothing hurts quite like being the father your children are embarrassed to claim. For 58 years, Dale Foster had carried that weight, watching his kids' faces turn away whenever he tried to prove he was worth something. Dale was a small-town mechanic who'd just spent his mother's entire inheritance on a rusted military tank. Everyone laughed. His grown children shook their heads. His ex-wife called him foolish. Even Dale wondered if he'd finally lost his mind completely. But inside that forgotten piece of military history lay something that would change everything. Hidden in sealed compartments were stacks of cash, diamonds, and maps that belonged to one of the most dangerous cartels in North America. Money that powerful people had killed for decades ago. Now Dale wasn't just the town joke anymore. He was a marked man. The cartel wanted their treasure back, and they didn't care who got hurt along the way. Could a lifetime failure finally become the hero his family needed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Foster's auto repair, highlighting every crack in the weathered concrete and every rust stain on the aluminum siding. Dale Foster stood in his doorway, coffee mug in one hand, inheritance check in the other, watching Cedar Falls wake up the same way it had for the past 30 years. The town moved with the deliberate pace of people who'd learned that rushing rarely changed anything important. At 58, Dale carried himself like a man who'd grown accustomed to disappointment. His shoulders had developed a permanent slight hunch from decades of leaning over engine blocks, and his hands bore the permanent stains of a mechanic's trade grease under the nails, small scars from sharp metal, calluses that told the story of honest work that never quite paid enough. His brown hair had gone mostly grey at the temples, and his face showed the lines of someone who'd spent more time squinting at problems than smiling at solutions. The garage itself reflected its owner's struggles. 3 bays that should have been humming with activity housed only one car, Mrs. Henderson's ancient Buick, that needed more love than money could buy. Dale had been putting off telling her that the transmission work would cost more than the car was worth. He understood the attachment to things that had seen better days. Behind the counter, photographs told the story Dale preferred to forget. There was Marcus at 8, grinning with a gap-toothed smile as he handed his father a Father's Day card made from construction paper. Sarah at 10, pigtails flying as Dale pushed her on the tire swing he'd hung from the oak tree in their backyard. Linda, young and laughing, her arms around Dale's neck at their wedding, both of them convinced they could build something lasting. The later photos showed the slow erosion of those dreams. Marcus grew taller and more distant in each picture, his smile becoming polite rather than genuine. Sarah's eyes began holding questions Dale couldn't answer: why Daddy's business kept struggling, why Mummy looked worried all the time, why their house was smaller than their friends' houses. Linda's smile grew strained, her embrace less certain. The divorce papers had been finalized 3 years ago, but Dale still caught himself looking for Linda's car in the driveway some mornings. She'd been patient longer than he'd deserved, but even patient people eventually reach their limits. The final conversation had been civil, which somehow made it worse. She didn't scream or cry, she just looked tired and said she couldn't watch him disappoint their children anymore. Marcus, now 28 and working for some tech company in Grand Rapids, called every other Sunday like clockwork. Their conversations followed a familiar script. Dale would ask about work, Marcus would give brief, polite answers, then ask if Dale needed anything. Dale always said no, even when the answer should have been yes. Pride, his mother used to say, was often just fear wearing a fancy hat. Sarah, 25, and teaching 3rd grade in Kalamazoo, tried harder to maintain connection, but Dale could hear the effort in her voice. She'd invite him to school plays and holiday dinners, and he'd find reasons to decline. Not because he didn't want to be there, but because he couldn't bear to see that careful kindness in her eyes, the way you'd treat a wounded animal that might run if you moved too quickly. The inheritance check represented the last tangible piece of his mother's life. Eleanor Foster had lived to 93, maintaining her independence in the house where Dale had grown up until the very end. She'd saved every dollar she could, treating money like a finite resource that required constant vigilance. Dale had expected maybe enough for a modest funeral and some leftover bills. Instead, the lawyer had handed him a check for $47,000 and a handwritten note. "For my Dale, it's never too late to surprise people." His mother had always believed in him, even when the evidence suggested she shouldn't. When he dropped out of community college to marry Linda, she just nodded and offered to babysit. When his first business venture, a partnership with his buddy Ray, selling rebuilt engines, had collapsed due to Ray's gambling problem, she'd helped him find the money for the garage. When Linda left, his mother had shown up with a casserole and the simple statement that some things take longer to bloom than others. The government surplus auction in Grand Rapids had been an impulse decision, born from a restless Saturday morning and too much time thinking. Dale had driven the hour north with no particular plan, just a vague idea that he might find some useful equipment for the garage. The auction lot was a graveyard of military history, jeeps with canvas tops, rotted to shreds, communication equipment that looked like props from old war movies, and vehicles that had served their country before being declared surplus to requirements. The M63 Patton tank had been lot number 247, listed simply as armored vehicle, non-functional, sold as scrap. It squatted in the far corner of the lot like a sleeping giant, 30 tons of olive-drab steel that had once been the pride of someone's armored division. Rust had claimed sections of the hull, and weeds had grown up around the track system, but something about it had called to Dale. Maybe it was the way the morning sun caught the turret, or maybe it was the simple fact that it looked as forgotten and underestimated as he felt. The auctioneer had approached the tank with obvious reluctance. "Now, folks, this here's a 1,978 M63 Patton tank, decommissioned and sold for scrap metal only. Engines been pulled, weapons systems removed, and frankly, it'd take more money than sense to get her running again. We're starting bidding at $500. Dale had raised his hand without thinking, surprising himself as much as the scattered crowd of collectors and scrap dealers. The bidding had been lackluster. Most serious buyers understood that moving 30 tons of steel would cost more than the metal was worth. When Dale's final bid of $12,000 was accepted, he'd sat in his truck for 10 minutes, trying to understand what he'd just done. The tank was currently residing at Kowalski's Salvage on the outskirts of town, waiting for Dale to figure out how to transport it to his garage. Frank Kowalski, the lot's owner and Dale's neighbor, had been surprisingly understanding about the arrangement. Frank was a retired army sergeant who'd served 2 tours in Vietnam and understood the pull of military history, even when it came in the form of an expensive mistake. "She's a beauty," Frank had said, running his weathered hands along the tank's hull. "These patterns saw action all over the world. This one's got good bones, the rust looks worse than it is." Dale had nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed it. The tank looked like exactly what it was, a relic from another era, built for purposes that no longer existed, waiting to be broken down for parts. But there was something about its solid presence, the way it seemed to dare the world to move it, that resonated with Dale's stubborn streak. The phone call to Linda about the purchase had gone as expected. She'd listened with the patient silence of someone who'd heard similar stories before, then sighed in that particular way that meant she was choosing her words carefully. "Dale, honey, what are you planning to do with the tank?" He'd mumbled something about restoration being therapeutic, about having a project to work on during the slow winter months. Linda had made a non-committal sound that could have been agreement or resignation. The conversation with Marcus had been shorter and less kind. "Dad, you bought what? For how much?" Sarah had at least tried to sound supportive, asking questions about the tank's history and suggesting it might make an interesting display piece for the town's annual Heritage Festival. The truth was, Dale wasn't entirely sure what he planned to do with 30 tons of armored vehicle. The logical part of his mind understood that he'd just spent his inheritance on what amounted to the world's most expensive lawn ornament. But there was another part, the part that remembered being 8 years old and listening to his father tell stories about the war, about machines and men that had stood their ground when standing seemed impossible, that whispered, maybe this time would be different. His father had been a tank commander in Korea, though he'd rarely talked about it. Dale's clearest memory was of finding a box of photographs in the attic after his father's funeral. Images of young men standing beside machines that looked invincible. His father had been 22 in those pictures, lean and confident, wearing the kind of expression that suggested he'd never met a problem he couldn't solve. Dale had inherited his father's mechanical aptitude, but none of his certainty. The garage phone rang, interrupting his reverie. Dale answered with his standard greeting, "Foster's Auto Repair." Dale speaking. "Dale, it's Frank. You might want to come out here. Got a delivery truck trying to figure out how to load your tank, and I think you're going to want to supervise this operation personally." Dale drained his coffee and grabbed his keys. As he drove toward Frank's salvage yard, he allowed himself a moment of anticipation. Maybe this wasn't the smartest thing he'd ever done, but it wasn't the dumbest either. At 58, a man was entitled to at least one grand gesture, even if nobody understood it. The tank would need work, a lot of work, but Dale had spent his entire adult life fixing things that other people had given up on. Maybe it was time to see if the same skills that had kept Mrs. Henderson's Buick running for 15 years could bring 30 tons of military history back to life. And maybe, just maybe, restoring something that had once been powerful might help him remember what it felt like to be strong. 2 weeks later, Dale stood in his garage, staring at 30 tons of American steel and engineering. Getting the tank delivered had required a specialized heavy equipment transporter, 3 permits from the county, and Frank's connections with a crane operator who owed him a favor. The M60A3 pattern now dominated the space where Dale usually worked on cars, its bulk making the 3-bay garage feel cramped despite the high ceilings. The tank was uglier up close than he'd remembered. Rust had eaten through sections of the armor plating, and decades of neglect had left the exterior pitted and scarred. The olive-drab paint had faded to an uneven grey-green, and someone had welded over what appeared to be bullet holes in the turret, evidence of the machine's violent past. But beneath the decay, Dale could see the bones of something formidable. The main gun had been deactivated and plugged, but the turret still moved with surprising smoothness when he put his shoulder to it. Dale had ordered the service manual from a military surplus dealer, and the thick binder now sat open on his workbench, alongside blueprints he'd found online. The complexity was intimidating, hundreds of systems that had to work in perfect harmony to transform this metal beast into a functional war machine. The engine alone was a monster, a 750-horsepower Continental diesel that could push 30 tons to speeds that seemed impossible for something so massive. He'd started with the basics, stripping away layers of accumulated grime and cataloging what needed repair versus what needed complete replacement. The tracks were in better condition than expected, though several road wheels would need rebuilding. The transmission case showed signs of a slow leak that had been ignored for years, but the housing seemed solid. Working on the tank felt different from his usual automotive repairs. Everything was built to military specifications, designed to function in conditions that would destroy civilian vehicles. 3 days into the restoration, Dale was lying on his back beneath the hull when his inspection light revealed something that shouldn't have been there. According to the blueprints, the area behind the driver's position should have been solid armor plating. Instead, his light illuminated what appeared to be a seam barely visible, but definitely present. Dale ran his fingers along the metal, feeling the slight depression where 2 pieces of steel had been welded together and then carefully ground smooth. The discovery nagged at him through dinner and into the evening. Military vehicles were precision instruments. Every modification was documented, every change tracked through maintenance records. But this seam wasn't on any of the blueprints he'd studied. Dale had learned to trust his hands during 40 years of mechanical work, and his hands told him someone had modified this tank after it left the factory. The next morning, Dale arrived at the garage before sunrise, equipped with his welding torch and a determination to solve the mystery. The seam ran in a rough rectangle, approximately 3 feet by 18 inches, positioned where a driver would be unlikely to notice it during normal operation. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to hide this modification, using military-grade steel and professional welding techniques. Dale worked carefully, using a cutting wheel to trace the original weld line. The metal separated reluctantly, sparking and grinding until finally a section of armor plating fell away to reveal a hidden compartment. Dale's inspection light penetrated the darkness, and his breath caught in his throat. The compartment was filled with carefully arranged bundles wrapped in thick plastic. Dale reached in with trembling hands and pulled out the first package. Through the plastic, he could see the distinctive green of American currency, not just a few bills, but thick stacks bound with rubber bands. The bundle felt substantial, heavy with the weight of serious money. There were dozens of similar packages, each one sealed against moisture and time. Dale's hands shook as he unwrapped the first bundle, revealing crisp $100 bills that looked as fresh as the day they'd been printed. His mechanical mind tried to calculate quantities, while his heart raced with the implications. There was more money in this hidden compartment than Dale had seen in his entire life. But the cash wasn't the only treasure hidden within the tank's modified hull. Nestled between the currency bundles were smaller packages that gleamed when Dale's light hit them. Diamonds, uncut stones that caught and scattered the light in brilliant displays of fire and ice. Dale had no experience with precious gems, but even his untrained eye could recognize the quality of what he was holding. These weren't chips or industrial stones, they were substantial gems that represented serious wealth. At the bottom of the compartment, wrapped in oiled cloth, Dale found a collection of hand-drawn maps. The paper was yellowed with age but still legible, showing routes that ran from the southwestern United States into Mexico. Numbers were penciled beside various locations, and symbols marked what appeared to be safe houses or supply points. Some of the routes were marked with dates from the 1980s, and Dale could make out references to airstrips and border crossings that meant nothing to him but clearly held significance for whoever had created these documents. Dale sat on his garage floor, surrounded by more wealth than he'd dreamed possible, his mind struggling to process the discovery. This wasn't lottery, luck, or inheritance surprise. This was something darker, something that explained why a perfectly functional military vehicle had been sold as scrap. Someone had hidden a fortune inside this tank, and that someone hadn't planned on it being sold at a government auction. The rational part of Dale's mind understood that he should contact the authorities immediately. This money clearly didn't belong to him, and the circumstances of its hiding suggested illegal activity. But another part of him, the part that had spent 58 years being overlooked and underestimated, whispered that maybe fortune had finally smiled on Dale Foster. He was still sitting among the bundles when a shadow fell across the garage's open bay door. Dale looked up to see a man in a dark suit standing just outside, his hands clasped behind his back, in a posture that suggested military training. The stranger was perhaps 40 years old, with the kind of lean build and alert eyes that came from a lifetime of staying in shape for dangerous work. "Good morning, Mr. Foster," the man said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Dale couldn't place. "I understand you recently acquired some military equipment. Might I have a word?" Dale's blood turned cold. He was surrounded by evidence of the largest discovery of his life, caught literally red-handed with wealth that clearly belonged to someone else. The stranger's calm demeanor was somehow more frightening than aggression would have been. This was a man who didn't need to raise his voice to be intimidating. "I'm sorry, we're closed," Dale managed, his voice steadier than he felt. "If you need automotive work, you can come back during business hours." The stranger smiled, and the expression held no warmth whatsoever. "I'm not here about automotive work, Mr. Foster. I'm here about what you found inside that tank. And I think we both know this conversation is going to happen one way or another." Dale's hand moved instinctively toward the wrench on his workbench, but the stranger shook his head slowly. "There's no need for drama, sir. I simply want to discuss a business proposition. You found something that belongs to my employers, and they're prepared to be reasonable about its return." The morning sun streaming through the garage door seemed to dim as Dale realized his restoration project had just become something far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. The money spread around him wasn't just a windfall, it was evidence of something that powerful people had killed to protect. And now, those people knew exactly where to find him. Dale stared at the stranger, his mechanic's instincts telling him this man was as dangerous as a faulty brake line. The casual way he'd mentioned employers and business propositions carried the weight of serious threat beneath polite words. Dale had lived long enough to recognize when someone was offering him a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. "I think there's been some misunderstanding," Dale said carefully, not moving from his position on the garage floor. "This is just an old tank I bought at auction. Government surplus, completely legal." The stranger stepped into the garage, his movements deliberate and controlled. Up close, Dale could see the quality of his clothing, expensive suit, polished shoes, and a watch that probably cost more than Dale's truck. This wasn't some local thug or desperate criminal. This was a professional. "Mr. Foster, please don't insult my intelligence," the man said, glancing at the scattered bundles of cash. "You've discovered something that was never meant to be found. My employers are prepared to compensate you for your time and trouble, but they do expect their property to be returned." Dale's mouth went dry. "What kind of compensation?" $50,000, cash, more than enough to purchase several tanks, should you wish to continue your restoration hobby. The offer hung in the air between them. 50,000 was more than Dale made in a good year, enough to save his business and maybe even impress his children. But looking at the money spread around him, Dale suspected he was holding considerably more than 50,000. And the stranger's willingness to pay that much suggested the real value was far higher. "I need time to think about this," Dale said. The stranger checked his expensive watch. "Of course, you have 24 hours to consider the offer. I'll return tomorrow morning for your answer." He reached into his jacket, a movement that made Dale tense, and withdrew a business card. "My name is Miguel Santos. When you're ready to discuss this further, simply call the number on the card." Santos placed the card on Dale's workbench and walked toward the door. At the threshold, he paused and looked back. "Mr. Foster, I want to be clear about something. My employers are reasonable people, but they're also very persistent. This situation can be resolved easily and profitably for everyone involved, or it can become complicated. I sincerely hope you choose the easy path." After Santos left, Dale sat motionless for several minutes, listening to his own heartbeat and the distant sounds of Cedar Falls going about its normal business. The normalcy outside his garage felt surreal compared to the scene inside stacks of cash, precious stones, and maps that clearly documented illegal activity. Dale began photographing everything with his phone, documenting the money, diamonds, and especially the hand-drawn maps. His mechanical training had taught him to record details before making changes, and instinct told him this information might prove valuable. The maps were particularly intriguing, detailed routes with codes and symbols that suggested a sophisticated operation. Some locations were marked with dates from the 1980s, while others appeared more recent. By afternoon, Dale had counted approximately $1.4 million in cash and filled a coffee can with uncut diamonds. The maps covered smuggling routes from California to Texas, with particular detail around border crossings and remote airstrips. One map was marked Hermanos Network, with a date from 1987, and several locations were circled in red with notations that looked like names or code words. Dale's hands shook as he rewrapped everything and sealed the hidden compartment. This wasn't just money, it was evidence of an operation that had been running for decades. And if Santos was willing to pay $50,000 just to make it disappear, the real value was probably 10 times that amount. That evening, Dale drove to Frank Kowalski's salvage yard. Frank was in his office, a converted trailer that served as headquarters for his scrap metal business. At 72, Frank moved with the careful precision of someone whose body had absorbed more punishment than it should have, but his mind remained sharp as the day he'd left the army. "Dale, you look like you've seen a ghost," Frank observed, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "Something wrong with the tank?" Dale had known Frank for 15 years, ever since moving to Cedar Falls. Frank was the kind of neighbor who showed up with his snow plow after winter storms and never mentioned the favor afterward. If anyone could be trusted with this situation, it was Frank. "I found something inside the tank, Frank, something that wasn't supposed to be there," Dale explained the discovery, watching Frank's expression grow increasingly serious. When he mentioned Santos and the $50,000 offer, Frank leaned back in his chair and whistled softly. "Son, you've stepped in something deep," Frank said. "Miguel Santos isn't a name I recognize, but that approach, polite threats wrapped in business language that's cartel methodology. These people don't make idle offers." "Cartel?" Dale's stomach dropped. Frank nodded grimly. "Drug cartels have been using military equipment for smuggling since the 1980s. They'd buy surplus vehicles, modify them for transport, then abandon them when the heat got too intense. Sounds like someone forgot to clean out their mobile safe before selling it to Uncle Sam." Frank stood and moved to a filing cabinet, withdrawing a folder thick with newspaper clippings and official documents. "I've been tracking this stuff for years, occupational hazard of the salvage business. You see, enough military equipment with questionable histories, you start paying attention to patterns." The folder contained articles about cartel operations, government investigations, and seized assets dating back to the Reagan administration. Frank had highlighted references to modified military vehicles and hidden compartments used for smuggling operations. "Look at this," Frank said, pointing to a 1987 newspaper article. "Los Hermanos Cartel was broken up by a joint DEA-CIA operation. They were using modified military vehicles to transport drugs and money along established routes from Mexico to distribution points in the Southwest. The operation was shut down, but most of the money was never recovered." Dale studied the article, noting references to sophisticated smuggling networks and military-grade transportation systems. The timeline matched the dates on some of the maps he'd found. "Frank, what would you do in my situation?" The older man was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the darkening sky. 20 years ago, I would have told you to turn it over to the authorities and hope for the best. But I've learned some hard lessons about trusting the system to protect good people who find themselves in bad situations." Frank pulled out another folder, this one containing military photographs and personal documents. "I served 2 tours in Vietnam." Dale came home to find out some of the operations I'd been part of weren't exactly what we'd been told. Sometimes the line between the good guys and the bad guys isn't as clear as you'd like it to be. Dale examined the photographs, young soldiers standing beside military vehicles, their faces showing the mixture of confidence and uncertainty that marked every generation sent to fight wars they didn't fully understand. "What are you saying, Frank?" "I'm saying that whoever hid that money in your tank didn't do it accidentally, and whoever sent Santos to retrieve it has been looking for it for a long time. These people don't give up, Dale. They'll keep coming until they get what they want, or until someone stops them permanently." Frank leaned forward, his expression serious. "You've got 24 hours to make a decision that's going to affect the rest of your life. You can give them what they want and hope they leave you alone, or you can dig in and fight." But understand that if you choose to fight, you're not just fighting for money, you're fighting for your right to live without looking over your shoulder for the rest of your days. Dale drove home through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls, his mind racing with possibilities and consequences. The simple life he'd known for 58 years had disappeared the moment he'd opened that hidden compartment. Whatever he decided in the next 24 hours would determine whether Dale Foster remained a small-town mechanic with big dreams or became something else entirely. As he pulled into his driveway, Dale noticed a dark sedan parked across the street. The driver was barely visible behind tinted windows, but the message was clear. He was being watched. The easy life was over, and the clock was ticking. Dale spent a sleepless night staring at the ceiling, weighing options that all seemed to lead to disaster. By morning, he'd made a decision that surprised him with its clarity. He wasn't giving up the money without a fight. 58 years of being overlooked and dismissed had taught him that sometimes the only choice was to stand your ground, even when the odds seemed impossible. The dark sedan was gone when Dale checked his window at sunrise, but he understood that didn't mean he wasn't being watched. He drove to the garage with unusual caution, checking his mirrors and taking a roundabout route that would reveal any tale. The streets of Cedar Falls looked the same as always, but Dale felt like he was seeing his hometown through different eyes, noting sightlines, escape routes, and places where someone could observe his movements. At the garage, Dale made 2 phone calls that would change everything. The first was to his son, Marcus, who answered on the 3rd ring with the slightly irritated tone of someone interrupted during important work. "Hey, Dad, what's going on? I'm kind of in the middle of something here." "Marcus, I need your help with something technical. Computer work. Could you drive up this weekend?" There was a pause. "Dad, you know I can help you over the phone with most computer stuff, right? What kind of technical work are we talking about?" Dale had rehearsed this conversation, but actually having it felt surreal. "I've found some encrypted files that need professional attention, the kind of work that requires your skills and complete discretion." Another pause, longer this time. "Dad, that sounds kind of mysterious. What exactly have you gotten yourself into?" "The kind of situation where I need my son's help, and I can't explain it over the phone." Marcus's tone shifted, recognizing something serious in his father's voice. "Okay, I can drive up Saturday morning. This better not be some scheme to get me to help you move furniture or something." "No furniture, Marcus, I promise." The second call was to Frank, who answered before the first ring finished. "Dale, I've been thinking about our conversation last night. You make your decision yet?" "I'm keeping the money, Frank. All of it." Frank was quiet for a moment. "That's either the bravest thing I've heard in years or the most foolish. Maybe both. You realize what you're signing up for?" "I realize I'm tired of being afraid, and I think that money might be the key to something bigger than just a cartel's lost stash." "What do you mean?" Dale looked at the maps spread across his workbench. "Those routes are still active, Frank. Some of the markings look recent. This isn't just about recovering old money, it's about a current operation that someone wants to keep hidden." Frank arrived at the garage within an hour, bringing coffee and a grim expression. Together, they studied the maps more carefully, noting details that had escaped Dale's initial examination. The routes formed a comprehensive network covering thousands of miles, with particular concentration around border areas known for drug trafficking. "This is sophisticated," Frank observed, tracing one route with his finger. "Military-level planning and execution. Whoever created this network knew what they were doing." "The question is whether they're still doing it," Dale said. Frank pointed to a map marked with more recent dates. "Based on these notations, I'd say yes. Look at these codes that correspond to current highway designations. GPS coordinates that didn't exist in the 1980s. Someone's been updating this network for decades." At exactly 10 o'clock, Miguel Santos returned to the garage. He entered with the same calm confidence as before, but Dale noticed his eyes immediately assessed the scene, noting Frank's presence and the maps still visible on the workbench. Mr. Foster, I trust you've had time to consider my offer, Santos said, nodding politely to Frank. I don't believe we've been introduced. Frank Kowalski, Frank said, not offering his hand. I'm here as Dale's advisor. Santos smiled. How prudent. Mr. Foster is fortunate to have experienced counsel during these negotiations. There are no negotiations, Dale said, standing straighter than he had in years. I'm keeping the money. Santos's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. I'm disappointed to hear that, Mr. Foster. My employers were hoping this could be resolved amicably. Your employers can be disappointed, Frank said. Dale found that money legally, on property he legally owns. Far as I can see, there's no crime in keeping what you find. Ah, but there are complications, Santos replied smoothly. The money in question was part of a federal investigation that remains ongoing. My employers have legitimate concerns about certain evidence falling into the wrong hands. Dale felt his resolve waver for a moment. Federal investigation suggested government involvement, which meant this situation was even more complex than he'd imagined. But Frank stepped forward, his military bearing evident. What agency are you representing, Mr. Santos? Because in my experience, federal agents identify themselves properly and present appropriate credentials. Santos studied Frank with new interest. You're military, Mr. Kowalski. I can tell by your posture and the way you assess threats. What branch? Army. 2 tours in Vietnam, another in Desert Storm. Retired sergeant, if it matters to you. It matters very much, Santos said. Military men understand the importance of following orders and respecting chain of command. Perhaps you can explain to Mr. Foster the consequences of interfering with operations beyond his understanding. Frank smiled, and Dale recognized the expression from their neighborhood poker games. Frank had just been dealt a winning hand. Maybe you can explain to me why a federal operation is being handled by someone who won't show proper identification. Santos reached into his jacket, and both Dale and Frank tensed. But instead of a weapon, he withdrew a leather wallet and displayed what appeared to be federal credentials. Special Agent Santos, DEA. This tank and its contents are evidence in an ongoing investigation. Frank examined the credentials carefully, then handed them back. Impressive documentation, Agent Santos. When did the DEA start conducting operations without warrant documentation? This is a matter of national security. This is a matter of someone trying to recover money that doesn't belong to the government, Frank interrupted. Because if it did, you'd have shown up with a warrant, backup, and a formal seizure order. Instead, you're here alone, offering cash payments for evidence. That's not how federal agents operate. Santos's careful composure began to crack. Mr. Kowalski, you're interfering with a federal investigation. That's a serious crime. So is impersonating a federal agent, Frank replied calmly, and threatening civilians, and attempting to steal evidence from private property. Dale watched the exchange with growing confidence. Frank's military experience was showing Santos that this wouldn't be the easy intimidation the man had expected. But Dale also understood that refusing Santos's offer meant the situation would escalate beyond polite threats. Agent Santos, Dale said, emphasizing the title with deliberate skepticism. You can tell your employers that their money is safe with me, but it's staying where it is until someone provides legitimate legal documentation proving ownership. Santos stared at them for a long moment, his mask of professional courtesy finally slipping to reveal something darker underneath. Mr. Foster, Mr. Kowalski, you're making a serious mistake. My employers are not patient people, and they have resources you can't imagine. So do we, Frank said quietly. After Santos left, Dale and Frank stood in the garage, both understanding that they'd just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The money hidden in the tank had become the prize in a game where the rules weren't clear and the stakes were potentially lethal. Think he'll be back? Dale asked. Frank nodded grimly. He'll be back, but next time he won't come alone, and he won't be nearly as polite. Dale looked at the tank dominating his garage, this machine that had somehow become both his salvation and his curse. "Frank, what are we getting ourselves into? A fight, son. The kind where you either win completely or you don't get to walk away at all." Saturday morning brought Marcus to Cedar Falls in his silver Honda Civic, along with a laptop bag that suggested he'd taken Dale's request for technical help seriously. At 28, Marcus had inherited his father's mechanical aptitude, but channeled it into cybersecurity rather than automotive repair. He stood in the garage doorway, staring at the massive tank with an expression that mixed amazement with concern. "Dad, when you said you bought military equipment, I was thinking maybe a Jeep or something. This is a freaking tank." Dale felt a familiar surge of pride mixed with anxiety. Marcus's approval had always mattered more than Dale wanted to admit, and seeing his son impressed by something Dale had accomplished felt better than it should have, given the circumstances. "She's a 1978 M60A3 pattern," Dale said, running his hand along the hull with proprietorial affection. 30 tons of American engineering." Marcus walked around the tank, his technical mind clearly cataloging details. "Dad, this thing is incredible. But why did you need my computer skills? I mean, it's not like tanks have Wi-Fi." Dale exchanged glances with Frank, who had arrived early to help with what they'd started calling the briefing. Both men had agreed that Marcus needed to understand the full situation before being asked to help, but explaining it felt like dragging his son into danger. "Marcus, sit down. What I'm about to tell you is going to sound unbelievable." For the next hour, Dale and Frank explained the discovery, Santos's visits, and their growing suspicion that the money represented something far more significant than a simple cartel stash. Marcus listened with the focused attention he'd shown as a child when Dale explained how engines worked, but his expression grew increasingly troubled. "Let me understand this," Marcus said finally. "You found over $1 million and a bunch of diamonds hidden in a tank. Some guy claiming to be a federal agent wants to buy it back for $50,000, and you told him no." "That's the simplified version," Dale admitted. Marcus stood and began pacing, a habit he'd developed during stressful situations. "Dad, this is insane. If this Santos guy is really DEA, you're interfering with a federal investigation. If he's not DEA, then you're dealing with criminals who kill people over a lot less than $1 million. Which is why we need your help," Frank said. "Those maps Dale found are encrypted, and they might tell us who we're really dealing with." Marcus stopped pacing and looked at the maps spread across the workbench. His technical training kicked in as he studied the symbols and notations, recognizing patterns that meant nothing to Dale or Frank. "These aren't just maps," Marcus said after several minutes of examination. "This is a comprehensive data system. Look at these coordinates. They're not just marking locations, they're creating a network topology. Someone built a communication and logistics system that spans multiple states. Can you decode it?" Dale asked. Marcus opened his laptop and began photographing the maps with high-resolution detail. "Maybe. But Dad, if I crack this encryption, we're going to know things that people have killed to protect. Are you sure you want to go down this road?" Dale looked at his son, really looked at him, seeing not the disappointed child who'd grown distant over the years, but a capable man who'd built a successful career on his own terms. Marcus had become everything Dale had hoped for, despite Dale's failures as a father. "Marcus, I've spent my whole life being careful, being reasonable, taking the safe path and watching other people succeed while I just got by. This might be the only chance I ever get to prove I'm more than just the guy who couldn't make it work." Marcus studied his father's face, seeing something he'd never noticed before, not just determination, but a kind of desperate hope that was painful to witness. "Okay, Dad, but we do this smart. No cowboy stuff, no unnecessary risks. We figure out what we're dealing with before we make any more decisions." The next several hours transformed Dale's garage into an impromptu command center. Marcus connected his laptop to a portable printer Frank had brought from the salvage yard, creating hard copies of the encrypted files while simultaneously running decryption software. Frank provided military perspective on the tactical elements of the maps, while Dale contributed mechanical knowledge about the modifications made to the tank. By afternoon, Marcus had made significant progress. "The encryption is sophisticated but not unbreakable," he reported. "It's based on a military cipher from the 1980s, probably something the original network used for operational security. But whoever updated these maps used modern GPS coordinates, which gives me reference points for breaking the code." As Marcus worked, Frank examined the tank more thoroughly, discovering additional modifications that suggested extensive planning. "Dale, look at this," Frank called from beneath the hull. "They didn't just add one hidden compartment. There are at least 3 separate modifications down here. This tank was converted into a mobile command center." Dale crawled under the tank to see what Frank had found. Additional welding marks indicated hidden compartments that were still sealed, and cable runs suggested the tank had once contained sophisticated communication equipment. "It's like they turned it into a mobile headquarters," Dale said. "Exactly. Which means the money you found was just part of the operation. There might be more hidden throughout this machine." Marcus called out from his laptop, "Guys, you need to see this. I've broken part of the code, and it's not what we expected." Dale and Frank crowded around Marcus's laptop screen, which displayed a partial translation of one of the maps. Instead of simple smuggling routes, the decoded information revealed a complex intelligence network with references to federal agencies, foreign operatives, and operations that extended far beyond drug trafficking. "This isn't just cartel activity," Marcus said, his voice tight with concern. "These maps reference CIA operations, DEA task forces, and what looks like a joint intelligence operation from the 1980s. Dad, this tank wasn't just used by criminals, it was part of some kind of government black ops program." Frank leaned back against the workbench, his face pale. "Iran-Contra," he said quietly. "What?" Dale asked. "Iran-Contra scandal. 1980s. CIA was running covert operations in Central America, using drug money to fund anti-communist rebels. It was supposed to be secret, but some of it came out during congressional investigations." Marcus's fingers flew over his keyboard, cross-referencing the decoded information with historical records. "Frank's right. These routes match up with known Iran-Contra supply lines. But some of this data is current, like updated within the last few months current." The implications hit Dale like a physical blow. The money hidden in his tank wasn't just cartel proceeds, it was evidence of government operations that were supposed to remain buried. And if Santos was really DEA, it meant federal agencies were actively trying to recover evidence of their own illegal activities. "We're not just dealing with criminals," Dale said slowly. "We're dealing with people who have government resources and no accountability." Marcus closed his laptop with a decisive snap. "Dad, we need to get out of here. Now. If this information is accurate, then we're sitting on evidence that could bring down federal officials, expose ongoing covert operations, and potentially compromise national security. People disappear over stuff like this." But before anyone could respond, the sound of multiple vehicles approaching made them all freeze. Through the garage windows, they could see black SUVs taking positions around the building, too many vehicles and too much coordination for a simple recovery operation. Frank moved to the window and peered out carefully. 6 vehicles, multiple agents, full tactical gear. This isn't Santos coming back for another chat. Dale felt the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. His simple restoration project had become something far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined, and now his son was trapped in the middle of it. But looking at the tank, this massive, armored symbol of American military might, Dale realized they might have more options than running. "Frank," Dale said, his voice steadier than he felt, "you mentioned this tank might still have some of its original capabilities." Frank grinned grimly. "Son, are you thinking what I think you're thinking?" Marcus looked between them with growing alarm. "Please tell me you're not considering using a tank against federal agents." Not against them, Dale said, moving toward the tank's driver position, just to negotiate from a position of strength. Outside, amplified voices began shouting orders, and the sound of boots on concrete indicated the operation was moving into its final phase. Whatever was about to happen, Dale Foster's quiet life in Cedar Falls was over. But maybe, just maybe, something better was about to begin. The voice that came through the bullhorn was crisp and authoritative, carrying the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Dale Foster, this is Agent Williams, Drug Enforcement Administration. We have a federal warrant to search these premises. Exit the building with your hands visible and comply with agent instructions. Frank peered through the window again, his military experience reading the tactical deployment with professional interest. 12 agents, full body armor, automatic weapons. They're not taking any chances. Dale felt his heart hammering against his ribs, but there was something else mixing with the fear, a strange sense of clarity he'd never experienced before. For 58 years, he'd backed down from every confrontation, chosen the safe path, let other people make the important decisions. But standing next to 30 tons of armored steel, with his son beside him and Frank at his back, Dale discovered he was tired of being afraid. "Marcus, get down behind the tank," Dale said, his voice carrying a note of command that surprised everyone, including himself. "Dad, what are you doing?" "What I should have done years ago. Standing my ground." Dale climbed into the tank's driver position, his hands finding controls that Frank had helped him understand during their restoration work. The diesel engine had been rebuilt to military specifications, and Frank had insisted on testing all systems just to be thorough. Now Dale was grateful for that thoroughness. The engine turned over with a deep rumble that seemed to shake the entire building. 30 tons of steel and determination came to life with a sound that spoke of power and purpose. Through the driver's periscope, Dale could see agents scrambling to reposition themselves around a target they hadn't expected to move. "Dale Foster, shut down the vehicle immediately," Agent Williams commanded through the bullhorn. "You are interfering with a federal operation." Frank had climbed into the commander's position, his familiarity with military vehicles evident in how quickly he oriented himself to the controls. "Dale, the main gun's been deactivated, but the coaxial machine gun mount still has its intimidation factor, and this armor will stop anything they're carrying." Marcus had pressed himself against the rear of the tank, his laptop bag clutched to his chest. "This is insane," he muttered, but Dale noticed his son wasn't trying to leave. Despite his fears, Marcus was staying to help his father. Dale keyed the tank's external communication system, his voice projecting through speakers that had once coordinated battlefield movements. "Agent Williams, I'm a United States citizen on my own property. I've broken no laws, and I'm not surrendering my legal possessions without proper documentation." The response was immediate and predictable. "Mr. Foster, you are in possession of evidence in a federal investigation. Exit the vehicle, or we will consider you in armed rebellion against federal authority." "Then you better call for bigger guns," Dale replied, surprised by his own boldness. Frank was studying tactical displays that were surprisingly functional for a vehicle sold as scrap. "Dale, they've got us surrounded, but they're positioned for a foot assault on a building, not for dealing with an armored vehicle. If we move now, we can break through their perimeter." "And go where?" Marcus asked, his voice muffled by the tank's hull. "My place," Frank said. "I've got 40 acres and defensive positions they don't know about, plus some equipment that might even the odds." Dale looked at the garage that had been his livelihood for 15 years, knowing that whatever happened next, he'd never be coming back to the simple life of automotive repair and quiet desperation. But for the first time in decades, that thought didn't terrify him. "Marcus, can you operate that laptop from inside the tank?" "If I can get a data connection, yes." "Why?" "Because we're going to need those maps, and we're going to need to understand exactly what we're up against." Dale put the tank in gear, feeling the massive machine respond to his commands with surprising agility. The garage door had never been designed to accommodate a tank, but 30 tons of moving steel didn't need permission from building codes. The explosion of wood, metal and concrete as they burst through the garage door was spectacular. Dale had expected resistance, but the tank's momentum carried them through the wall like it was made of cardboard. Behind them, his garage collapsed in a shower of debris that would have killed anyone standing inside. Agent Williams and his team scattered as the tank emerged into daylight, their tactical formation useless against an opponent they'd never trained to face. Dale could see agents speaking rapidly into radio headsets, calling for backup, and probably wondering how a simple evidence recovery had turned into an armored vehicle pursuit. The tank's tracks bit into the asphalt of Main Street, leaving deep gouges that would mark this day in Cedar Falls history. Dale had lived his entire adult life trying not to attract attention, and now he was driving a tank through downtown in broad daylight with federal agents in pursuit. "Take the left at Miller Road," Frank instructed, his voice calm despite the chaos around them. "We need to get off the main streets before they coordinate a proper response." Dale swung the tank, left with more confidence than he felt, the massive vehicle responding better than his pickup truck on winter roads. Behind them, black SUVs were beginning pursuit, but their drivers were clearly uncertain about how to handle a target that could drive through roadblocks without slowing down. Marcus had managed to get his laptop operational, the screen glowing in the tank's dim interior. "Dad, I'm tracking emergency radio traffic. They're calling in state police, National Guard, even talking about air support. This is going to escalate fast." "How long until we reach Frank's place?" Dale asked. 15 minutes if we can maintain speed," Frank replied. "But they're going to try to cut us off at the county line." Dale pressed harder on the accelerator, feeling the tank's massive engine respond with impressive power. The speedometer read 40 miles per hour, not fast for a car, but terrifying for 30 tons of armor moving through rural Michigan countryside. Behind them, the pursuit convoy was growing. Local police had joined the federal agents, and Dale could see news helicopters beginning to circle overhead. His attempt to quietly resolve a complicated situation had become a full-scale incident that would be on national television within the hour. "Marcus," Dale called over the engine noise, "are you getting anything useful from those encrypted files?" "Still working on it, but Dad, some of this stuff is seriously classified. Financial records, operational codes, personnel files. This isn't just evidence of old crimes. This is current intelligence that could compromise ongoing operations." Frank twisted in his seat to look at Marcus. "What kind of operations?" "The kind that don't officially exist." "Dad, if this information gets out, it won't just embarrass some government officials, it could expose active agents, compromise foreign sources, maybe even get people killed." Dale felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. He'd thought he was fighting for his right to keep money he'd found legally, but the stakes were apparently much higher than a simple civil dispute. "Frank, tell me about your place. What kind of defensive positions are we talking about?" Frank smiled grimly. "Let's just say that retirement from the army doesn't mean you stop preparing for contingencies. I've got enough firepower and defensive positions to hold off a company of infantry, plus communication equipment that can reach people who might be interested in our situation." "What people?" "People who understand that sometimes the government needs to be reminded that it serves the citizens, not the other way around." The tank crested a hill, revealing Frank's property spread out below them, 40 acres of woodland and open fields, with a farmhouse that looked ordinary except for the suspicious number of antennas and the fact that all the windows had been replaced with what appeared to be armored glass. "Welcome to Fort Kowalski," Frank said proudly, "built to withstand everything from tax auditors to foreign invasion." Dale guided the tank down the gravel driveway, feeling like he was entering another world. Behind them, the convoy of federal vehicles had stopped at the property line, agents clearly debating their next move. Attacking a fortified position held by military veterans was not covered in standard DEA training. As they reached the farmhouse, Dale shut down the tank's engine and sat in the sudden silence, trying to process what had just happened. In the space of one morning, he'd gone from small-town mechanic to fugitive from federal justice, and somehow his son and neighbor had chosen to stand with him. "Dad," Marcus said quietly, "there's something else in these files you need to know. The money you found, it's not the end of this." According to these records, there are similar caches hidden all over the country, millions of dollars in government funds that were supposed to disappear during Iran-Contra, but were hidden instead. Dale looked at his son, seeing the mixture of fear and excitement in Marcus's eyes. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we didn't just find cartel money, Dad. We found the key to a treasure hunt that's been going on for 30 years. And now, everyone who's been looking for these caches knows exactly where we are." Inside Frank's farmhouse, the atmosphere was tense with revelation and regret. Frank had led them through a basement entrance that revealed the true nature of his retirement project, a sophisticated command center that would have impressed military intelligence professionals. Banks of communication equipment lined the walls, and multiple computer monitors displayed everything from local police radio traffic to satellite imagery of the surrounding area. Dale sat heavily in a chair that had seen better days, the adrenaline of their escape finally giving way to the magnitude of what they'd stumbled into. Marcus was at one of the computers, his laptop connected to Frank's system, working through the encrypted files, with resources that far exceeded anything Dale had imagined his neighbor possessed. "Frank," Dale said slowly, "this isn't exactly what I expected from a retired army sergeant's basement." Frank was checking weapons that he'd pulled from concealed storage compartments, military-grade equipment that definitely wasn't available at the local sporting goods store. "Dale, there's something I need to tell you, something I should have explained when you first found that money." The tone in Frank's voice made both Dale and Marcus stop what they were doing and pay attention. Frank's usual easy confidence had been replaced by something heavier, the weight of secrets carried too long. "I wasn't just any army sergeant," Frank began, his words careful and measured. "I was part of a special operations unit that handled classified logistics during the Iran-Contra operations. My team was responsible for moving money, equipment, and personnel through networks that officially didn't exist." Dale felt the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. "You knew about the tank. You knew what was hidden inside it." Frank nodded, his face showing the strain of decades-old guilt. "Not specifically, but I knew vehicles like that existed. We had dozens of them, modified military equipment used to transport assets that couldn't go through normal channels. When the Iran-Contra scandal broke, most of the equipment was supposed to be destroyed or returned to standard configuration. But some of it wasn't," Marcus said, looking up from his computer. "No," Frank confirmed. "Some of it disappeared. Our unit was disbanded. Most of the records were classified or destroyed, and those of us who survived were given new identities and told to forget everything we'd seen." Dale stood and began pacing, anger building as he processed the implications. "So when I bought that tank, you knew it might contain classified materials. When Santos showed up, you knew he wasn't really DEA. And when we decided to fight, you knew we were going up against people with government resources." "Yes," Frank said simply. "Why didn't you tell me?" Frank was quiet for a long moment, then moved to a filing cabinet and withdrew a folder thick with official documents. "Because I thought the past was buried. Because I hoped that tank was just what it appeared to be. Surplus military equipment sold legitimately. And because I've spent 30 years trying to forget what my government asked me to do in the name of national security." He handed the folder to Dale. "But when Santos showed up, I knew the past had found us. That's my real service record, Dale. My real name isn't Frank Kowalski, it's Francis Kowalczyk, and I was part of Operation Black Eagle, a classified unit that moved CIA funds through Central America from 1985 to 1988. Dale examined the documents, service records, commendations, and operational summaries that painted a picture of a soldier who'd been involved in activities that straddled the line between patriotism and criminality. The unit citations mentioned extraordinary service in maintaining operational security for sensitive financial transfers and exceptional performance in classified logistics operations. "Frank, what exactly did your unit do?" "We were the bank," Frank said bluntly. "When the CIA needed to move money for operations that couldn't appear in any official budget, they called us. When they needed to hide assets from congressional oversight, we provided the infrastructure. When operations went wrong and money needed to disappear, we made it happen." Marcus looked up from his computer, his face pale. "Frank, according to these files, your unit handled over $200 million in unauthorized transactions. Money that was supposed to fund anti-communist rebels, but was also used for arms deals, drug operations, and bribes to foreign officials." Frank nodded grimly. "It was the Wild West, son. The Cold War was ending, the Soviet Union was collapsing, and everyone in intelligence was scrambling to position themselves for whatever came next. Lines got blurred between national interest and personal profit." Dale sat back down, overwhelmed by the scope of what they'd uncovered. "So, the money in my tank is part of a network that was supposed to be shut down 30 years ago," Frank finished. "But according to what Marcus has found, someone kept the network active, someone who had access to the original infrastructure and decided to use it for their own purposes." Marcus turned his laptop screen toward them, displaying an organizational chart that looked like something from a corporate presentation. "This is what I've been able to reconstruct from the encrypted files. The original Operation Black Eagle infrastructure was maintained by a group of former intelligence officers who went into private business after the Cold War ended. The chart showed connections between defense contractors, private security firms, and government officials that formed a web of influence spanning decades. Names that Dale recognized from news reports were connected to companies he'd never heard of, all linked by financial relationships that suggested ongoing coordination. "It's a shadow government," Marcus continued. "People who use classified knowledge and government connections to run private operations that serve their own interests rather than national security. And the money you found was their operational fund." Frank studied the chart with the expertise of someone who'd spent years inside covert operations. This explains why Santos wasn't really DEA and why the federal response was so aggressive. These people don't work for the government anymore, they work for themselves, but they still have contacts throughout the intelligence community. Dale felt the room spinning as he grasped the full implications. "We're not fighting cartel members or corrupt federal agents. We're fighting people who have been using government resources for private gain for 30 years, and who will do anything to protect their operation." "That's right," Frank said, "and now that they know we have evidence of their activities, they can't let us walk away. We know too much to be left alive." Marcus's phone buzzed with an incoming message. He glanced at the screen, and his face went white. "Dad, it's from Sarah. She says men in suits showed up at her school asking questions about you. They told her principal it was a federal investigation and that family members might be in danger." Dale's blood turned to ice. Sarah, teaching 3rd grade in Kalamazoo, completely innocent of anything beyond wanting her father to be proud of her. The thought of these people threatening his daughter made something fundamental shift inside Dale's chest. "Frank, you said you had communication equipment that could reach people who might be interested in our situation. What people?" Frank moved to his communication console and began powering up equipment that looked like it belonged in a military command center. Other veterans from Black Eagle who survived and kept quiet. Journalists who've been investigating Iran-Contra connections for decades. Congressional staffers who've never stopped asking questions about missing funds. "And they'll help us?" Frank's smile was grim but determined. Dale, you've just handed them evidence that could expose the biggest government corruption scandal since Watergate. They'll help us because this is what they've been waiting 30 years to find. Marcus was already typing rapidly on his laptop. I'm creating encrypted copies of everything and uploading them to secure servers. If something happens to us, this information will automatically be released to every major news outlet and government oversight committee. Dale looked around the command center at Frank with his classified past, at Marcus with his technical skills, and at the evidence that could bring down people who'd been operating in the shadows for decades. His simple restoration project had become something far bigger than he'd ever imagined. So what do we do now? Frank checked his weapons and moved toward the stairs. Now we prepare for a siege, son, because those people outside aren't going to wait much longer to come for what we have. And when they do, we're going to show them that some secrets are too dangerous to keep buried. The next 18 hours transformed Frank's farmhouse into a fortress under siege. Through the reinforced windows, Dale could see federal vehicles maintaining a perimeter at the edge of the property, but no one had approached the house since their arrival. The waiting was almost worse than active confrontation. It gave Dale too much time to think about how his simple desire to restore something had put his family in mortal danger. Marcus had worked through the night, creating multiple encrypted copies of their evidence and establishing secure communication channels with Frank's network of contacts. The young man who'd arrived reluctantly to help his father with computer work had become the digital architect of what might be the largest government accountability scandal in American history. "Dad, I've confirmed that Sarah's safe," Marcus reported, looking up from his laptop with tired but determined eyes. Frank's contacts got her into protective custody with journalists who specialize in government whistleblower cases. She's in a secure location with people who understand what we're dealing with. Dale felt some of the crushing weight lift from his chest. Whatever happened to him, at least his daughter would be protected. "What about your mother?" "Linda's fine. She's staying with her sister in Florida and doesn't know anything about this situation. The cover story is that you're helping with a federal investigation and family members need to maintain distance for their own safety. Gote VT investigation of course today under the prize. Gote VT invasing 5. Frank was at his communication console, coordinating with contacts who'd been monitoring the federal response. "Dale, we've got confirmation that the people outside aren't standard DEA or FBI. Satellite imagery shows at least 3 different agency vehicles, plus several that don't match any known federal fleet configurations." "Meaning what?" "Meaning we're dealing with a joint task force that includes people from agencies that don't officially cooperate, plus private contractors who shouldn't be operating on American soil." Frank's expression was grim. "This is bigger than we thought, son. They're pulling resources from multiple government branches to contain this situation." Dale moved to the window, studying the perimeter through armored glass that Frank had installed as part of his retirement preparations. The federal vehicles were positioned with military precision, creating overlapping fields of fire that would make any escape attempt suicidal. But more concerning were the unmarked vehicles that had arrived during the night, black SUVs with tinted windows that suggested private military contractors rather than government agents. "How long can we hold out?" Frank checked his equipment inventory with the methodical precision of a professional soldier. "We've got food for a week, water for longer than that, and enough ammunition to fight off a small army. The real question is whether our evidence gets out before they decide to end this permanently." Marcus looked up from his computer. "About that, I've been tracking news coverage, and this story is already starting to break. Someone leaked information about a federal raid involving Iran-Contra evidence, and investigative journalists are connecting dots faster than the government can classify documents." Dale felt a surge of hope. "So the evidence is getting out." "Some of it," Marcus confirmed, "but the complete files are so damaging that major news outlets are hesitating to publish without additional verification. They're afraid of national security implications." Frank's radio crackled with incoming communication from one of his contacts. "Frank, this is Phoenix. The situation has escalated beyond normal channels. Congressional oversight committees are demanding briefings, and Justice Department officials are asking questions that suggest they don't know what their own agents are doing in Michigan. Frank keyed his microphone. Phoenix, what's the timeline for official intervention? Unknown. Political pressure is building, but these shadow network people have connections throughout government. They might have enough influence to contain this situation indefinitely. Dale listened to the exchange with growing understanding that their survival depended on factors beyond their control. They had evidence that could expose decades of government corruption, but only if they lived long enough to present it properly. The secure phone that Frank had given Dale rang with the distinctive tone that indicated a call from the outside perimeter. Dale answered cautiously. "Mr. Foster, this is Deputy Director Harrison, Federal Bureau of Investigation." The voice was professional but carried undertones of serious concern. "I'm calling to discuss a resolution to this situation that protects everyone's interests." "I'm listening," Dale said, noting that Frank was recording the conversation. "We understand you've uncovered information related to historical intelligence operations. The Bureau is prepared to offer full immunity and witness protection in exchange for cooperation with a formal investigation." Dale felt Frank's hand on his shoulder, a warning to be careful. "What kind of cooperation?" "Complete transfer of all materials and testimony before a closed congressional committee. In return, you and your family receive new identities and federal protection from any retaliation." The offer sounded reasonable, but Dale had learned enough about government operations to be suspicious of anything that sounded too good to be true. "And if I refuse?" Harrison's pause was telling. "Mr. Foster, the people surrounding your current location include individuals who don't answer to the Bureau. I can't guarantee your safety if this situation isn't resolved through proper channels." After ending the call, Dale turned to Frank and Marcus. "What do you think?" Frank shook his head immediately. "Dale, I've seen how witness protection works for people who know too much about classified operations. Sometimes witnesses disappear permanently for their own safety." Marcus was analyzing the call on his computer. "Dad, I tracked that phone number. Deputy Director Harrison is real, but the call was routed through multiple relays that suggest surveillance by people who aren't supposed to be monitoring FBI communications." Dale moved back to the window, watching as additional vehicles arrived at the perimeter. The federal presence was growing, but so was the number of unmarked vehicles that suggested private military involvement. "They're building up for something," Dale observed. Frank joined him at the window. "Final assault. They've given us a reasonable offer through official channels, and when we refuse, they'll claim we're terrorists or enemy combatants. At that point, normal rules don't apply." Marcus's laptop chimed with an urgent message. "Guys, we've got a problem. I'm monitoring police radio traffic, and they're evacuating civilians from a 5-mile radius around this property. They're calling it a gas leak emergency, but the deployment pattern looks like preparation for military action." Dale felt the weight of finality settling over the situation. "How long do we have?" Frank was checking his defensive systems, motion sensors, surveillance cameras, and automated alert systems that would detect any approach to the house. "Based on the evacuation timeline, probably 6 hours until they move. They'll wait for full darkness to minimize media coverage." Dale looked around the command center that had become their fortress, seeing it clearly for perhaps the first time. Frank had spent 30 years preparing for this moment, not specifically this situation, but the possibility that his government past would catch up with him. The weapons, the communication equipment, the defensive positions, all of it had been building toward a confrontation with people who operated outside the law while claiming to protect it. "Frank, you knew this day would come, didn't you?" Frank nodded slowly. "Not exactly this, but something like it. When you've seen how government really works behind the scenes, you understand that the rules only apply to people who don't have enough power to break them. Eventually, someone like me was going to find evidence that powerful people couldn't afford to have exposed." Marcus closed his laptop and moved to the weapons Frank had laid out. "So what's the plan?" Dale looked at his son, 28 years old, successful in his own right, choosing to stand with his father despite having every reason to walk away. The pride Dale felt was mixed with terror at the thought of losing Marcus to violence that Dale had brought into their lives. "The plan is to survive long enough for the truth to get out," Dale said, "and to make sure that whatever happens to us, the evidence of what these people have been doing reaches the right hands." Frank was studying tactical displays that showed the federal perimeter tightening like a noose. "Then we better get ready, son, because in 6 hours we're going to find out whether 3 civilians with the truth can stand against a shadow government with unlimited resources." Dale picked up one of Frank's rifles, surprised by how natural it felt in his hands. His father had taught him to shoot as a boy, but Dale had never imagined using those skills to defend evidence that could change American history. "Marcus, are the files fully uploaded and distributed?" "Multiple copies to secure servers worldwide," Marcus confirmed. "Even if they destroy everything here, the evidence will survive." Dale nodded, feeling something settle into place inside his chest. Not peace, exactly, but a kind of clarity he'd never experienced before. For 58 years, he'd avoided confrontation, chosen safety over principle, let other people fight the important battles. But some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed impossible. "Then let's see if we can survive to tell this story ourselves." Darkness fell over Frank's property, like a curtain dropping on the final act of a play that had spiraled far beyond anything Dale could have imagined when he'd bought a rusted tank at government auction. Through night vision equipment that Frank had produced from his seemingly endless supply of military gear, Dale could see the federal perimeter tightening with the precision of a military operation. "Movement on the North Ridge," Frank reported from his observation post. "Sniper teams taking elevated positions. South approach shows tactical vehicles moving into assault formation." Dale was positioned at the main window, his father's dog tags around his neck, a tangible connection to family military service that gave him strength he didn't know he possessed. The tags had been in his father's effects for 40 years, and Dale had never understood why his mother had insisted he keep them. Now, facing a battle he never could have anticipated, they felt like a blessing from a generation that had understood the cost of standing for principle. Marcus was at the communication console, maintaining contact with the outside world while monitoring federal radio traffic. "Dad, I'm picking up chatter about Operation Cleanup. Sounds like they're planning to move in 30 minutes. The irony wasn't lost on Dale that his son, who'd spent years disappointed by his father's lack of ambition, was now risking his life to help expose government corruption that most people would never believe existed. Marcus had inherited Dale's mechanical aptitude and his mother's intelligence, but he'd also found something Dale had always lacked: the courage to stand up when standing up mattered. Frank's voice came through their internal communication system. "Dale, they're using thermal imaging to map our positions. Good news is this house was built to military specifications. Insulated walls will mask our heat signatures. Bad news is they know exactly how many of us are in here." Dale adjusted his position behind cover that Frank had designed into the house's structure. Every window was bulletproof, every wall was reinforced, and firing positions had been built into the architecture with the forethought of someone who'd spent decades expecting this kind of confrontation. "How many are we facing?" 30-plus agents from multiple agencies, plus at least a dozen private contractors. They've got night vision, body armor, automatic weapons, and authorization to use whatever force they deem necessary. Dale checked his rifle, a military-grade weapon that Frank had maintained in perfect condition despite its unofficial status. "Frank, I need you to know something. Whatever happens tonight, I'm grateful you stood with me. You could have walked away when this got complicated." Frank's response came with the dry humor of a soldier who'd faced worse odds in foreign countries. "Son, I've been waiting 30 years for a chance to balance the books with these people. You just gave me the opportunity." Marcus called out from his position. "Movement on all sides. Looks like they're beginning final approach." The first gunshot shattered the rural Michigan silence like thunder, followed immediately by the distinctive crack of high-powered rifles targeting the house. Frank's bulletproof windows held, but the sound was a declaration that negotiation time was over. "Return fire, but conserve ammunition," Frank instructed. "Make every shot count." Dale aimed through his firing port, targeting muzzle flashes in the darkness. His first shot was answered by immediate suppressing fire that forced him back behind cover. The federal agents were professionals. Their coordination and tactics spoke of extensive training and experience. But Frank's defensive preparations proved their worth. The house's reinforced structure absorbed rifle fire that would have been devastating to normal construction, and Frank's strategic positioning gave them overlapping fields of fire that made approach difficult for the attackers. "North window, 2 agents advancing," Dale reported, squeezing off careful shots that forced the federal team to seek cover. Marcus was proving surprisingly effective with the rifle Frank had given him. "Dad, there's something you should know. I did 2 years of competitive shooting in college. Mom never told you because she was afraid you'd want to go hunting together." Despite everything, Dale found himself smiling. "We're definitely going hunting together after this is over." The assault intensified as federal teams realized the house wouldn't fall to initial pressure. Flashbang grenades exploded outside windows, and Dale could hear the distinctive whine of tactical drones overhead. Frank's voice carried the calm authority of someone who'd managed combat operations before. "They're probing for weak points. Stay disciplined. Don't waste ammunition on shots you can't make." Dale was settling into a rhythm of combat that felt both terrifying and strangely natural. Sight picture, breathing, trigger control. Fundamentals his father had taught him for hunting deer were keeping federal agents from reaching the house. "Marcus, how are our communications holding up?" "Still transmitting. Phoenix is coordinating with news outlets, and congressional oversight committees are demanding real-time briefings on what's happening here." Frank's defensive systems were proving effective, but Dale could see the federal teams adapting their tactics. "They're bringing up heavier equipment," he reported, watching as a vehicle approached that looked more like military hardware than law enforcement gear. The explosion when the first grenade hit the house was tremendous. Reinforced walls absorbed most of the blast, but the concussion was enough to rattle teeth and blur vision. Frank's military engineering was being tested by weapons that were supposed to be used against foreign enemies, not American citizens. "Structural damage?" Frank called out. Dale checked his section of the house. "Windows holding, walls intact. Your construction standards are impressive." 20 years of planning and paranoia," Frank replied. "Sometimes paranoia pays off." The battle was becoming a siege. Federal forces had the numbers and equipment, but Frank's preparations and their defensive position created a stalemate that could last hours. Dale found himself thinking about Sarah, safe in protective custody, and Linda, unaware that her ex-husband was fighting a war she'd never understand. Marcus's voice cut through the gunfire. "Dad, I'm getting reports that this operation isn't authorized by Justice Department leadership. Congressional oversight is demanding immediate stand-down orders. Will they comply?" Frank answered grimly. "These people have been operating outside official authority for 30 years. Congressional orders won't stop them now." Another explosion rocked the house, this one closer and more powerful. Dale could see tactical teams moving to flank their position, using the cover of smoke and darkness to advance on the building. "Frank, they're adapting faster than we can hold them off." "Then it's time for the ace in the hole," Frank replied. "Dale, can you get to the tank?" Dale looked through the rear window toward the M60A3 Patton, sitting in Frank's yard, like a sleeping giant. 30 tons of armored steel that had started this entire situation. The tank still runs like a dream. And unlike this house, it's mobile armor that can take the fight to them instead of waiting for them to bring it to us. Dale understood immediately. The tank wasn't just transportation, it was a weapon platform that could change the entire dynamic of the battle. but reaching it would require leaving the safety of the house and crossing open ground under fire. "Cover me," Dale said, moving toward the rear door. "Dad, wait," Marcus called out. "Let me come with you." Dale looked at his son, seeing determination that matched his own. "Marcus, this is dangerous. So is everything else we've done tonight. We're in this together." Frank's covering fire was immediate and devastating, precise shots that forced federal agents to seek cover, while Dale and Marcus sprinted across open ground toward the tank. Bullets whined through the air around them, but Frank's marksmanship kept the federal teams from achieving effective fire. Dale reached the tank first, his hands finding the driver's hatch with muscle memory from weeks of restoration work. The engine turned over immediately. Frank's mechanical expertise had ensured the machine was ready for exactly this situation. As Marcus climbed into the commander's position, Dale felt the massive machine come alive beneath them. 30 tons of American military engineering designed to face enemy forces on foreign battlefields was about to engage federal agents on American soil. "This is either the bravest thing we've ever done or the most insane," Marcus said through the tank's intercom. Dale put the tank in gear, feeling its tremendous power respond to his commands. "Maybe both, but we're not backing down now." The M60A3 Patton rolled toward the federal perimeter with the inexorable force of historical inevitability, carrying 2 civilians who discovered that sometimes the most important battles are fought by people who never intended to be warriors. The M60A3 Patton emerged from behind Frank's farmhouse like a mechanical dragon awakening from slumber, its massive form silhouetted against the burning remains of tactical equipment. Dale felt the tank's power through every control surface, 30 tons of American engineering that transformed him from a small-town mechanic into something federal agents had never trained to fight. "Federal agents, this is Dale Foster," Dale announced through the tank's external speakers. "I am a United States citizen defending my constitutional rights on private property. Stand down immediately." The response was immediate and overwhelming, automatic weapons fire that sparked harmlessly off the tank's armor plating. Dale had expected fear, but instead felt a calm determination that surprised him. For the first time in his adult life, he was the one with superior firepower. "Marcus, can you operate the communications gear from your position?" "Working on it," Marcus replied, his voice tight with concentration. "Frank installed some impressive electronics in this thing. I'm patching into federal radio frequencies now." Dale guided the tank toward the nearest cluster of federal vehicles, their occupants scrambling to reposition equipment that had been designed for assaulting a building, not engaging armored vehicles. The sight of agents diving for cover as 30 tons of steel approached, their position would have been comical under different circumstances. "Dad, I'm hearing radio chatter about anti-tank weapons," Marcus reported. "They're calling for military support." "How long until it arrives?" "Unknown, but congressional oversight committees are demanding real-time updates. This is being broadcast live on multiple news networks." Dale could see camera crews at the perimeter, their lights creating a surreal atmosphere around what should have been a covert operation. The shadow network that had operated in darkness for decades was being exposed under television lights that made secrecy impossible. The tank's main gun had been deactivated, but Frank had maintained the coaxial machine gun mount for historical accuracy. Dale discovered that historical accuracy could be remarkably intimidating when federal agents found themselves facing a weapon system designed to destroy enemy positions. "This is Deputy Director Harrison," a voice crackled through the tank's radio system. "Mr. Foster, you are in violation of federal law. Surrender immediately or face military response." Dale keyed the microphone with hands steadier than he'd expected. "Deputy Director Harrison, I am exercising my constitutional rights as an American citizen. The evidence in my possession proves that your operation is unauthorized and illegal. Stand down your forces." Marcus was monitoring multiple communication channels simultaneously. "Dad, Phoenix is reporting that Justice Department officials are disavowing knowledge of this operation. Someone high up is getting nervous about media coverage. Dale maneuvered the tank between the federal perimeter and Frank's house, using the machine's bulk to shield Frank's position while presenting an armored target that conventional law enforcement weapons couldn't penetrate. The tactical situation had reversed. Instead of being besieged, they were now controlling the battlefield. Movement to the east, Marcus reported. Looks like someone's trying to flank our position. Dale swung the tank's turret toward the movement, the massive gun barrel tracking across federal positions with mechanical precision. Even deactivated, the psychological effect of a tank gun pointed in your direction was profound. Frank's voice came through their radio system. "Dale, you've got their attention. They're pulling back to defensive positions and calling for instructions. What about the private contractors?" "Still engaged, but they're outgunned now. Turns out civilian mercenaries aren't equipped to fight actual military hardware." Dale could see the truth of Frank's assessment. The unmarked vehicles were withdrawing to safer distances while federal agents tried to establish new defensive positions. The balance of power had shifted dramatically in favor of 3 civilians, with evidence that powerful people couldn't afford to have exposed. Marcus's monitoring equipment crackled with intercepted communications. "Dad, I'm hearing something interesting. Congressional oversight committees have ordered immediate suspension of this operation, pending investigation. Justice Department officials are demanding explanations from agency heads who claim they didn't authorize the assault." Dale felt a surge of hope. "Are they complying?" "Some of them. FBI and DEA units are receiving stand-down orders, but the private contractors aren't subject to government authority." As if summoned by Marcus's words, a new vehicle appeared at the perimeter, a black SUV that moved with the confidence of people who didn't answer to federal oversight. Dale watched through the tank's periscope as figures in tactical gear deployed from the vehicle, carrying equipment that looked more sophisticated than standard law enforcement gear. "That's not federal," Frank observed through their communication system. "That's private military." The new arrivals immediately began coordinating with the remaining federal agents, their movements suggesting command authority that superseded official government hierarchy. Dale understood that these were the people Frank had warned about: shadow network operatives who used government resources for private purposes. "Marcus, are you still transmitting to the outside?" "Multiple channels. This entire operation is being broadcast live to news outlets and congressional oversight committees." Dale made a decision that would have terrified him 6 hours earlier, but now felt like the only rational choice. He aimed the tank directly at the private military position and began advancing at full speed. "Dale Foster, to all federal personnel," he announced through external speakers, "you have 30 seconds to withdraw from this property before I demonstrate why tanks were invented." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Federal agents who'd been following orders began withdrawing rapidly, unwilling to face down a tank for an operation they didn't understand. But the private contractors held their ground, deploying what appeared to be anti-tank weapons. "Dad, they're not backing down," Marcus warned. "Then they're about to learn something about American determination," Dale replied, pressing the accelerator harder. The explosion, when the anti-tank rocket hit the Patton's front armor, was tremendous, but the tank's design absorbed the impact without significant damage. Dale felt the concussion through the machine's structure, but they remained operational and angry. Frank's voice cut through the radio chatter. "Dale, that was a military-grade anti-tank weapon. These people have access to serious hardware." "So do we," Dale replied, continuing his advance toward the private military position. The second rocket missed entirely, its operator apparently rattled by the sight of 30 tons of armor, advancing despite direct hits. Dale could see private contractors abandoning their positions as federal agents continued withdrawing under congressional orders. Marcus was monitoring news coverage on his laptop. "Dad, this is amazing. Cable news is calling it the Tank Man of Michigan, Footage of you advancing against government forces is going viral worldwide. Dale felt the historical weight of the moment. His father had commanded tanks in Korea, fighting for American principles on foreign soil. Now Dale was using a tank to defend those same principles on American soil, against people who'd forgotten what they were supposed to serve. The private military leader, a man Dale could see through his periscope, was speaking rapidly into a satellite phone, clearly receiving instructions from higher authority. When the conversation ended, the man gestured to his remaining personnel, and they began withdrawing toward their vehicles. "They're pulling back," Marcus reported with surprise. Frank's voice carried grim satisfaction. "Media exposure. These people can't operate in daylight. Once their activities are being broadcast live, they lose their most important weapon, secrecy." Dale watched as the last private military vehicle disappeared into the darkness, followed by federal agents who'd received orders to withdraw, pending congressional investigation. In the space of one night, a small-town mechanic with a restored tank had forced a shadow government operation into retreat. "Is it over?" Marcus asked. Dale looked around the battlefield, scattered equipment, abandoned positions, and news crews documenting everything for history. "The shooting's over, but the real fight is just beginning." 6 months later, Dale Foster stood in the town square of Cedar Falls, Michigan, watching a crane carefully position the restored M60 A3 Patton tank on its new memorial pedestal. The morning sun gleamed off armor plating that bore the scars of that night in February, but also showed the careful restoration work that had transformed a forgotten piece of military surplus into a symbol of American resilience. The memorial plaque, cast in bronze and mounted prominently beside the tank, read simply, "In memory of Francis Frank Kowalczyk, United States Army, 1952-2025. A soldier who never stopped serving his country." Below that, in smaller text, "Dedicated to all Americans who stand up when standing up matters." Frank had survived the gunfight but suffered a heart attack 3 weeks later, his body finally succumbing to decades of stress and the weight of secrets carried too long. He'd lived just long enough to see the congressional investigations begin and to know that his sacrifice had meant something. Dale missed him every day, the steady presence, the dry humor, the unshakable certainty that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. Marcus approached from where he'd been coordinating with the memorial committee, his appearance reflecting the changes 6 months had brought. The young man who'd reluctantly driven to Cedar Falls to help his father with computer work now ran a cybersecurity consulting firm that specialized in protecting whistleblowers and government accountability advocates. The experience of fighting shadow government operatives had given Marcus both expertise and purpose that transformed his career. "The dedication ceremony is set for 2 o'clock, Marcus reported. "Congressman Williams will speak, along with the Justice Department special prosecutor and 3 investigative journalists who've been following the Iran-Contra connections." Dale nodded, still adjusting to the reality that his life had become a matter of public record and national interest. The congressional investigations, triggered by their evidence, had exposed a network of former intelligence officers who'd used classified knowledge and government connections for private gain over 3 decades. Dozens of officials had been indicted, hundreds of millions in illegal assets had been recovered, and reforms had been implemented to prevent similar operations in the future. The personal cost had been significant. Dale's garage was gone, destroyed in the firefight that had marked the end of his simple life as a small-town mechanic. But the government settlement compensation for property damage and recognition of his service to national security had provided resources he'd never imagined having. More importantly, it had given him the opportunity to build something meaningful with his remaining years. "How's the new shop coming along?" Marcus asked, referring to the expanded automotive facility Dale was building on the outskirts of town. "Better than expected. Turns out being known as the guy who fought the government with a tank is good for business. I've got more work than I can handle, and 3 employees who seem to think working for a folk hero is worth accepting reasonable wages." Marcus smiled, an expression that had become more frequent over the past 6 months. The shared experience of fighting for principle had healed wounds in their relationship that Dale had thought were permanent. Marcus visited Cedar Falls regularly now, not out of obligation, but because he genuinely enjoyed spending time with his father. Sarah approached from the other side of the square, leading a group of third graders who were taking a field trip to see their town's famous tank. At 25, Sarah had grown into the kind of teacher who inspired students to believe they could make a difference in the world. The pride Dale felt watching her work was untainted by the old shame that had colored their relationship for so many years. "Uncle Marcus," several children called out, having adopted Marcus as an honorary relative during his frequent visits. "Hey there, troublemakers," Marcus replied, kneeling to their level. "Are you here to see your grandfather's tank?" The children nodded enthusiastically. Their understanding of the events was simplified but clear. Sarah's father had found something important. Bad people had tried to take it away, and he'd fought them off using a tank. To 8-year-olds, this was the best possible story. Dale watched the interaction with deep satisfaction. The family that had been fragmented by his failures was healing through shared purpose and mutual respect. Sarah no longer looked at him with careful kindness. She looked at him with genuine admiration for courage she'd never known he possessed. Marcus sought his advice on business decisions and life choices, treating Dale as a mentor rather than a disappointment. Linda appeared at the edge of the crowd, having driven up from Florida for the memorial dedication. Their relationship remained complicated. She was proud of what Dale had accomplished, but also reminded him regularly that he could have consulted her before risking his life for principle. They weren't reconciling romantically, but the bitter edge had left their interactions, replaced by the comfortable familiarity of people who'd shared important years and continued to care for each other's well-being. "Dale," Linda said, approaching with the mixture of affection and exasperation that had characterized their marriage. "I still think you're the most stubborn man I've ever met, but I'm proud of what you did." "Thank you," Dale replied, meaning it more than she probably understood. The dedication ceremony was everything Frank would have wanted. Patriotic without being political, emotional without being sentimental, and focused on principles rather than personalities. Congressman Williams spoke about the importance of citizens who refuse to let government operate without accountability. The special prosecutor thanked Dale publicly for evidence that had led to the largest government corruption investigation since Watergate. The journalists explained how citizen whistleblowers had always been essential to American democracy. But the moment that mattered most to Dale came when Marcus took the podium to speak about Frank's sacrifice and Dale's courage. Looking out at a crowd that included neighbors who'd known Dale for 15 years but were seeing him clearly for the first time, Marcus spoke about the importance of ordinary people doing extraordinary things when circumstances demand it. "My father taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the square. "Courage is being afraid and doing what's right anyway. Frank Kowalczyk taught me that some secrets are too dangerous to keep buried, and together they taught me that American citizens have both the right and the responsibility to hold their government accountable." After the ceremony, Dale stood alone beside the tank memorial as the crowd dispersed. The massive machine looked different in daylight, less threatening, more noble, a symbol of strength used in service of justice rather than violence. Frank had been right about one thing. Sometimes the most important battles were fought by people who never intended to be warriors. Marcus joined him beside the memorial, both men comfortable with the silence that followed intense emotion. Finally, Marcus spoke. "Dad, do you ever regret buying this thing?" Dale considered the question seriously. The past 6 months had brought changes he could never have anticipated: danger, loss, recognition, and responsibility that had transformed his life completely. The simple existence he'd known was gone forever, replaced by something more complex, but infinitely more meaningful. "No," Dale said finally. "I regret that it took me 58 years to find something worth fighting for, but I don't regret the fight." Marcus nodded, understanding passing between father and son without need for additional words. They'd discovered that courage was hereditary, but had to be activated by circumstances that demanded it. They'd learned that principle mattered more than safety, that truth was worth defending regardless of cost, and that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they refused to accept extraordinary injustice. Dale looked around the town square of Cedar Falls, seeing his home with eyes that recognized its value clearly for the first time. This was a place where people knew each other's names, where children could walk to school safely, where neighbors helped each other through difficulties, and where citizens expected their government to serve the people rather than the other way around. It was worth preserving, worth protecting, and worth fighting for when necessary. The Tank Memorial would stand as a reminder that American citizens possessed both the right and the responsibility to hold their government accountable. More personally, it would remind Dale Foster that he'd finally become the man his father had hoped he'd be, the father his children deserved, and the citizen his country needed. As evening settled over Cedar Falls, Dale walked home to a house that no longer felt empty, carrying the satisfaction of a man who'd discovered that it's never too late to surprise people, including yourself.